Hello everyone, this is my blog about computer technology, episode number 12, January the 24th, 2012. It's the 12th episode and it's 2012. Okay, let me wish everybody a late Happy New Year. I'm just going to make a few adjustments here before I begin so that I have my notes at the ready. I'd like to take this time to talk about older operating systems and how they've evolved, including ancient Unix and its various incarnations, BSD, and Ultrix. Now, all three of these things are closely associated with Bell Labs, and basically it originated at Bell Labs, and everything that came after. And there's quite a plethora of different Unix variants. In this case, we're going to talk a lot about Digital Equipment Corporation because they used BSD and Ultrix. Ultrix is the DEC Unix. That came later. But first, we'll start with Unix version 7. Now, we could actually go further back and go all the way back to version 1, and there's actually a subversion repo for version number 1 of Unix. I'm not going to go that far back. I'm just going to talk about Unix. I'm going to mostly talk about Unix version 7. Now, I've actually ran Unix version 5, 6, and 7 on my Linux computer. Now, I don't really... going back farther than version 7 is kind of awkward. It's really difficult, and I hardly even think of it as Unix. So I'm going to say that version 7 is, in a lot of ways, the most interesting Unix to look at, and it was the last Bell Laboratories release to see widespread distribution before the commercialization of Unix by AT&T. So we can actually consider this to be the last common ancestor of all types of Unix. Okay, so let's talk about version 7. Version 7 came out of Bell Labs in 1979. The source code is freely available. Anybody who wants to can download it and run it on an emulator. So can you run Unix version 7 on a modern computer today? Yes, you can do that through the magic of emulation. One can use the SimH emulator to run various versions of Unix. SimH is a highly portable, multi-system emulator which runs on Windows, Linux, Mac OS X, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, NetBSD, OpenVMS, and probably other ones as well. SimH can emulate many old computers, including ones from Honeywell, DEC, IBM, MITS, Royal, McBee, and other ones. So what did we use for, in this particular case, Unix version 7? Okay, so basically we set up SimH to emulate a PDP-11/45 with 256K of memory, and we'll just elaborate on that a little bit. The PDP-11 series of computers were made by Digital Equipment Corporation. PDP stands for the Programmable Data Processor. These are 16-bit mini computers about the size of a large refrigerator. Okay, now some thoughts about Unix version 7. On startup, it executes /etc/rc. Okay, so you could say that a little bit differently. Say that /etc//rc. One can't use arrow keys to position the cursor or use the delete key. One must use Control-H instead. It's kind of a pain. That was one of the single most awkward things with using ancient Unix. And it's even worse if you go back further in time and use older versions. It's even worse, even more difficult to use. So, okay, so what do we have in Unix version 7? Well, there's a lot of things we don't have that we normally would consider to be part of Unix today. There's no ping, there's no telnet, there's no FTP, and of course there's no web browser. All we seem to have in this Unix is the CU command, which stands for call Unix. And also there's the UUCP Unix to Unix copy utility, and UUX, which is Unix to Unix command execution utility. That's what we used. I actually have a book on UUCP upstairs. I actually am old enough to remember using that. Okay, so back in the day, what did we do? We used UCP on modems connected to the computer's serial port, and then we would establish a dial-up connection with another computer. Okay. Also, there's no VI, there's no EX text editor, and that'll be keenly felt by any long-time Unix user not to have those utilities. Okay, for programming on Unix version 7, we have an assembler. The commands are AS and AS1. A Fortran compiler called F77, and a C compiler, as we know, the CC command. So, any modern C program would have to be significantly revised to use Unix version 7 to be able to compile it successfully. I tried to port a couple of things just to say I wrote a Unix version 7 compatible program, and I wasn't too successful. So I'm going to have to go back to that project and finish it someday. Unix version 7 does have some games built into it. Surprise, surprise. It has chess, it has checkers, it has backgammon, all the old ones, hangman, and blackjack. So lots of goodies in there. And you've got source code. You can go to /usr/src/games, and you can look at that source code. Now, user home directories are a little bit different. They're in a directory called /usr/ and then whatever the username is. In a modern Linux or BSD distro, it would normally be /home/username. Users' home directories are different in the older one. Okay, so another annoying limitation of Unix version 7 is that ls prints each file name on a separate line, and there's no way to clear, there doesn't seem to be any way to clear the terminal window that I know of. There might be a way. I wasn't able to figure that out. Also, there's no halt or shutdown script to shut down the operating system. So you can see when you're dealing with Unix version 7, you're dealing with a pretty bare bones version of Unix. But you have to remember that it came out a long time ago, 79. Okay, so we're talking about over 30 years ago. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is something called 2.11 BSD. BSD stands for Berkeley Software Distribution, which first appeared. Okay, now I'm not sure about this date. I've been doing research on it, and there's a lot of different versions of BSD. It's easy to become confused. The first date, the date I came up with was June 1992, so that's a huge leap forward in time. And I'm not 100% positive about that date. That might be wrong. Could be wrong. Okay, so to run 2.11 BSD, I am using SimH to emulate a PDP-11/73, and I'm running this with 3 megs of memory. There's some technical reason why 4 megs of memory doesn't work, although a PDP-11/73 can run 4 megs of RAM. So we're looking at a big step up in RAM. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of a comparison between this version of BSD with the Unix version 7, and we can see now on BSD 2.11 it does have TCP/IP capabilities, and it has telnet, it has FTP, and it has ping. No web browser though. Okay, 92 web browser was a bit of a rarity. Although there were, my understanding is there were web browsers in this time period, but this version of BSD does not have a web browser. Okay, so I actually used this to communicate with the modern Linux via FTP just to see what I could do with it, and the only FTP session I had any success with was anonymous FTP, so and I was successful transferring files that way. So there are games in /USR /games, which is the same location that Unix version 7 used. I was very surprised to see Zork included in the list of games. This is especially interesting. I actually played Zork on a Commodore 64 back in the 1980s. Zork was split into 3 different games for microcomputers since the PDP-11/73 Zork had a lot more memory than any Commodore 64 or any 8-bit computer of that time period had. So they didn't really have those smaller micros didn't have the memory, and they didn't have the disk storage capacity to handle it. So they split Zork. They split the original PDP Zork into 3 different games: Zork 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so let's go. Oops, that's wrong. Don't want to delete anything. Okay. Now the third one is DEC Ultrix. Ultrix is Unix from Digital Equipment Corporation. It is based on Berkeley 4.2 BSD with enhancements from 4.3 BSD, and I've actually emulated 2 versions of Ultrix. Okay, I'm using SimH to emulate Ultrix version 4.0 on a VAX. It actually used something called DXWM, or the DEC Windows Manager. In this case, to be more specific, I'm emulating a microVAX 3900 with 32 megs of RAM. VAX is DEC's replacement for the old PDP systems, and it used a 32-bit complex instruction set CPU. Okay. On this version of Ultrix, I was able to successfully use FTP, and I didn't have any problems at all. This is more modern. As you get more modern, it seemed to work better with a modern Linux, rather. And unfortunately, with SimH, I can't emulate any graphics, so I wasn't actually able to run the Windows Manager to see, what that looked like. Okay, so this version 4.0 of Ultrix is pretty much good enough to run as a text-only Unix. I mean, it pretty much had everything you'd need for a text mode Unix. There wasn't really much missing. Okay, so that brings us to the next one, which is Ultrix 4.5, which I emulated using a different program. This time I used GXEMUL, which in this case it emulated a DEC Station 5000/200 with and it ran at 25 megahertz and it had 64 megs of memory. So now we're getting more modern. I used the MIPS architecture, and it had a SCSI hard drive. I used a video resolution of 1024 by 864. Okay, so that was really interesting. It is actually a pretty polished GUI. I had Unix with the GUI. Had very clean looking fonts, which reminded me of the Macintosh a lot. And it's a pretty slick system. This type of a system would have been used in about 1995. Okay, so it had some games on it. It had the 15 puzzle. So it's pretty much a more complete version. You know, it gave you a taste of what the old Unix with the GUI looked like. Okay, so some conclusions. As operating systems gain more functionality, it is inevitable that the memory requirements will increase. If we compare the 256K Unix version 7 system to an average current system, I'd say an average current system today would have 2 gigabytes of memory, and then of course there's systems even bigger than that that have 4 gigs of memory or 8 gigs of memory. But if we compare the 256K Unix to a modern system with 2 gigabytes of memory, that is a increase in capacity, in memory capacity, of a factor of 8,000. Okay, so it is possible to run a modern BSD or Linux with considerably less memory than 2 gigabytes. It's one of the things I try to do. I try to run systems that are minimalist in some respects. For example, I run a lot of systems with 512 megs of RAM, and that works fine. And even I think I have an open BSD box. It only runs on 256 megs, and it runs a GUI. I'm running ICE WM. Works pretty good. But we can see that things have changed a lot, and there's absolutely no way you could pack the functionality of a system today into 256K. It's just not possible. I mean, you're dealing with picture files which are bigger than that, so there's just absolutely no way you'd be able to do it. So inevitably the old systems become obsolete, and you know, I try to make them last as long as I possibly can, but eventually you reach the point where you want to do all these cool things, and you just can't do it with the older systems. But just to keep things into perspective, I like to know every era of the technology and how it's changed. So as you can see, the gradual improvements are things like improvements in video resolution, increases in memory capacity, increases in hard drive storage space, and of course increases in processing speed. So okay, that's about all I wanted to say for now, and I hope that that people actually try out Unix version 7. It's very interesting. It's interesting to look at the old era. There's other operating systems as well. I'm going to look at it at a later time. There's things called there's actually a PDP 8 system, which was a 12-bit computer. Now the interesting thing about, and you know, people were using that type of thing in the 60s. PDP 8s were used in the 60s, and you know, they're about the same size as the other mini computers. They're about the size of a refrigerator. But the most memory you could have on one of those was 32 kilowords. Okay, 32K of 12-bit words. And when you look at those types of systems, okay, so a PDP-8 is it just has too small of a memory to even consider putting a Unix type system on there. So they didn't use Unix. They used something called OS/8, which, if you look at that, look, there's a lot of similarities between that and CPM. So you can see the pedigree that Gary Kildall got some ideas, and he was probably using DEC equipment at the time, and he probably got some ideas. You know, it's inevitable. You're going to get your ideas from somewhere. And you can emulate PDP-8 on SimH. You can emulate that on a modern machine. You can emulate the CPM as well. But I'm going to leave that for a later time, and I'm going to wrap it up. And thanks a lot for listening.